Charles Williams is a somewhat forgotten figure, I think quite unjustly, but when any discussion turns to the Arthurian poetry of the 20th century, his name invariably crops up. Not only that, but most of those with an interest in the field will admit that he contends with David Jones for the title of the most important and best Arthurian poet of modern times. If we wanted to make a complete survey of the Arthurian poems of the 20th century, the major ones, I think we would want to remember, alongside those poets, the short epic Arthurius, published in 1974 by John Heath Stubbs. And also, much less known, but terribly interesting and remarkable, the fascinating sequence of poems, The Holy Grail, which were published in 1962 by the American, indeed Californian, beat poet and medievalist Jack Spicer. I commend those to your attention because they are absolutely fascinating. The combination of academic medievalist with Californian beat poet is an improbable one, but the poems do work marvellously. So Jack Spicer, we'll perhaps have a lecture on him some other time, but not tonight. Excellent and interesting as both of these poets are, I think neither of them matches in richness or depth Charles Williams's 2 volumes of Arthurian poems, which were published in 1938 and 1944. And whether ultimately you decide that you like them or not, I think there's no doubt that Williams's Arthurian poems are an attempt, at least, at a major work, and a work with profound spiritual concerns, and therefore, I think, very much within the purview of the Temenos Academy. Williams's poems are available now only in a few somewhat specialised editions, which are not often seen. By contrast, there are dozens of English translations of Chrétien and many serviceable editions of Malory's Morte d'Arthur, including those in Penguin, the World's Classics, and even Wordsworth Classics. So I'm going to try at least to arouse your interest tonight in Williams's Arthurian poems if you have not yet read them. And because I'm going to do some close reading, I'm going to limit myself to poems from the first of his 2 major volumes. The first volume, Taliesin through Logres, which on the whole has the shorter and more concentrated poems. Williams at times seems to have delighted in putting obstacles in his own way, and I have to admit that the title of that volume, Taliesin through Logres, is one of those obstacles. W.H. Auden wrote, who, like Eliot, was a huge admirer of Williams's thinking and poetry, wrote to Williams that he was proposing to go out and buy Taliesin through Logres, but he said, I am a little afraid because I shan't know how to pronounce the title when I get to the shop. And quite seriously, I think that title in itself has probably put a good many people off. Wisely, he allowed C.S. Lewis to suggest the title for his second Arthurian volume, which came out as The Region of the Summer Stars, which is a far more harmonious and, on the surface at least, comprehensible title, but we have to cope with the titles as they are, so there it is. In the face of his disappearance from general awareness, I think it's necessary briefly to introduce Charles Williams himself as well as his work, and I'm going to assume that many people here know comparatively little about Williams. I can see certain people here who know a great deal, but I'm not going to allow that to put me off. I'm going to introduce Williams to you before we proceed to focus on the poems. When Charles Williams is thought about at all these days, it's usually, as Ian indicated, as a member of the Inklings, the informal group of Oxford writers who met in the late 1930s and during the Second World War, and who centred around C.S. Lewis. Obviously, the most famous members of the group now are, of course, C.S. Lewis himself and J.R.R. Tolkien. The group also included the philosopher Owen Barfield, another figure, I think, of great importance, but not enough known at the present day. Charles Williams, in fact, joined the Inklings only at the end of his life, really from 1939 until his death in 1945. For him, membership of the Inklings was a brief last phase in his career. Charles Williams was born in London in 1886, the son of a poor clerk. The family moved to St Albans when Williams was quite young, so most of his childhood was spent there. He attended St Albans Grammar School and went on with a scholarship to study at University College London, but his parents being too poor to support him while he studied, even though he had a scholarship to UCL, he was forced to leave and seek work, which he found in due course with the London branch of the Oxford University Press. So he spent his career in publishing. Williams began at the Oxford University Press in London, the London branch, not the Oxford branch, as a proofreader, which, short of being the boy who made the tea, was about the humblest job you could possibly have within the press. But he gradually made his way up in the press to become one of its central figures. He ran the World's Classics series. If you have any of those little dark blue hardback volumes which used to be so ubiquitous, then you will certainly have books that were chosen and commissioned and in some cases introduced anonymously or acknowledgedly by Charles Williams. Williams also ran the Oxford Standard Authors series, so that by these means he had in fact a huge but invisible effect in steering public taste during the 20th century. Williams was a key figure in deciding which works were presented as classics to the reading public during the first half of the 20th century. It was Williams also who invented the Oxford Companion to English Literature, which so many of us have consulted. And it was he who chaired and largely controlled the group that produced the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations. It was Williams who invited W.B. Yeats to edit the Oxford Book of Modern Verse after the project had been sitting neglected in the hands of Lascelles Abercrombie. So Williams had an important and influential but largely invisible career as a publisher with the OUP. But this was only one facet of his life, and Charles Williams was very definitely someone whose life had distinct facets. Williams had continued his fractured education after leaving UCL by attending evening classes, and in due course he began to teach these himself in the field of English literature, lecturing for the Holborn Institute, for the City Lit in London, and so on. Evening lecturing became a regular part of his life. Williams had a phenomenal memory for verse, and he was a dynamic and charismatic lecturer, so he built up a large following of people who would come to his lectures after work and stay to discuss poetry and also their personal lives and their problems. And here we get to another facet of Williams's life. Charles Williams was deeply committed to the spiritual life and saw this as thoroughly integrated with the life of the imagination. In many ways, as I've hinted, he was a forerunner of the Temenos vision. Williams was a Christian, non-sectarian, but by instinct and affinity a high Anglican, even an Anglo-Catholic. He also had links with the world of the esoteric. From 1917 until 1927, that is roughly from the ages of 30 to 40, he was an active member of the Fellowship of the Rosy Cross, a Christian esoteric organisation organised by the occultist A.E. Waite, and an organisation which descended from the more famous Order of the Golden Dawn, of which, of course, W.B. Yeats was an active member. The key to all this, clearly, was Williams's desire to express his spiritual aspirations in terms of ritual. That is, to dramatise and intensify with gesture, action and ceremony the connection which he sought and no doubt often felt with the divine. It may seem as if with publishing, lecturing and religious and esoteric activities, I've already outlined a very full life, but there is more. For Williams was a prolific author. He wrote 3 volumes of theology, which have been influential in the Anglican Church and which were also valued in the Orthodox tradition. He wrote 7 novels, essentially thrillers on spiritual themes, which are still in print and which indeed have a cult following, particularly in America. And in fact, I'm delighted to say that a couple of days ago, I had the welcome news that Faber and Faber, his original publishers of these novels, have just reissued Williams's 7 novels in their Faber Finds reprint series. So Williams's novels are once again available on this side of the Atlantic as well. There was even a recent project well on the way for making a Hollywood film out of one of his novels, but unfortunately it was derailed by the recent financial crisis. So the film of All Hallows Eve, which we were expecting, has not happened. But clearly his work has a kind of life which bubbles away energetically under the surface, although never quite breaking through to popular awareness. Significantly, we're sort of approaching the theme of our Temenos series here. One of his novels, War in Heaven, published in 1930, was about the discovery of the Holy Grail in modern England. The Holy Grail turns up as a plain silver chalice in an English country church and is stolen by a group of black magicians who try to use it for evil purposes. But the novel is in no way an Arthurian work, so I'm going to leave it aside, interesting though it is in many ways. On top of his theology and his novels, Williams was also a successful verse dramatist, closely associated with T.S. Eliot and Christopher Fry in the religious drama movement of the 30s and 40s. His play, Thomas Cranmer of Canterbury, was performed in Canterbury Cathedral in 1936 as a follow-up to the previous year's offering, which was T.S. Eliot's Murder in the Cathedral. As a footnote, I'll just add that Williams also wrote historical biography and literary criticism, and reviewed extensively, covering serious books for Time and Tide, and for some years crime fiction for the News Chronicle. You will gather from all this that Williams was what we would now call a workaholic, and some people have attributed his somewhat short life, he died when he was only 58, simply to overwork, and there was a case to be made for that. But, and here we reach the real point, as Ian indicated, Charles Williams saw himself essentially as a poet, and following his unexpected and untimely death in 1945, it was the simple word poet that was carved upon his gravestone in St. Cross Churchyard, Oxford. Williams's career as a poet falls into 2 parts. Between 1912 and 1925, he published 4 volumes of fairly conventional verse, which would certainly, I think, not be remembered today on their own merits. But these early books were not really dealing with the material that was closest to his heart, or at least after the first one, which was a group of love sonnets, which certainly were close to his heart. But from there on, he nursed a subject which he did not yet feel he had found the way to put into verse. Probably from as early as 1913, when he was around 27 years old, what Williams really wanted to do was to write an epic about King Arthur and the Grail. He had, of course, read Malory's treatment of the Arthurian legends, and he'd read the Victorian treatments of the theme in Tennyson's Idylls and Swinburne's Tristram of Lyonesse, and so on. But Williams felt dissatisfied with all of these, feeling that in one way or another, all of these important treatments had missed profound possibilities of meaning within the legends and had failed to bring these out. He could see significances, he could see realms of meaning which neither Malory nor Tennyson nor Swinburne had managed to draw out, and his ambition was to bring these out in a poem of his own. But he couldn't find the appropriate form for his own treatment of these legends. As he said wryly, the idea of another long blank verse poem on the Grail seemed so depressing. So he kept a commonplace book of notes, cuttings, and ideas on the theme of Arthur and the Grail, and bided his time meditating on how this theme might be dealt with. He published a small number of lyrics on Arthurian themes in a collection of poems called Heroes and Kings, which came out as a limited edition in 1930, but he remained dissatisfied with them. The turning point came in the mid-1930s, as a result, I suspect, of three main factors. One of these was that between 1930 and 1933, Williams, in a way, took a break from writing poetry and instead wrote 3 books of literary theory in which he thought deeply about the nature of poetry. The 2 really important volumes of this trilogy are The English Poetic Mind and Reason and Beauty in the Poetic Mind. I would love to talk about these at length, not the occasion to do it today, but I will say that if you go back and look at those 2 books now, you will find that Williams has there anticipated every development of literary theory in the late 20th century. The books were so far ahead of their time that they sank more or less without trace. Go back to them now and they are brilliant, and they have recently come to attention again because they have been drawn on and discussed by Geoffrey Hill in his recent lectures. So I think that tells you how far ahead of their time those books were. At any rate, those years of reflection on the nature of poetry seem to have changed and reoriented his own practice. He stood back from the writing of poetry and considered the theory before resuming his poetic work. A second factor was that in 1930 he was involved in editing the poems of Gerard Manley Hopkins for their first fully public publication by Oxford University Press. The poems had been available previously as a small limited edition, but Williams was charged with editing Hopkins for a full-scale edition by the Oxford University Press. The close reading of Hopkins' verse gave Williams the impetus to modernise his style. I mean, we see it as modernising, of course, because we're looking through our 21st century spectacles. Let's say to change his verse in a way which moved it into a harmony with, if you like, the 20th century vision. It taught Williams to pay a renewed attention to matters of stress and alliteration and to free his verse lines to attain a greater flexibility and to engage in linguistic experiment. It had a galvanizing effect on his poetic style. The third factor, I suspect, was a serious illness which Williams underwent in 1933, during which he nearly died. I believe that the effect of this illness was to make Williams realise that he might not have much time left to say what he had to say. There was a new urgency in his work, and having faced imminent death, he also acquired what one might call a touch of recklessness about how he was going to deal with the material. In other words, he stopped worrying about whether he was making himself entirely clear to his audience and simply wrote as he really wanted to write. The result was a complete transformation of his poetic style. And it resulted in 2 volumes of poems which earned him a place, I believe, as a major 20th century poet. And I have committed myself to the task of writing a new biography of Williams, simply because I believe that he was a major poet to whom justice has not been done. Those 2 volumes are, of course, his Arthurian volumes, Taliesin through Logres, published 1938, and The Region of the Summer Stars, 1944. The volumes are unusual in Arthurian literature in that they do not consist of a long narrative poem or a set of long narrative poems, but rather of groups of lyrical and reflective poems on various aspects of the Arthurian legends. Certainly they tell stories quite often, but they are not primarily narrative poems. Williams assumes that we already know the story of King Arthur, his knights, and the Grail, as told by Malory. And his poems offer reflections, new angles, reinterpretations, or close-ups of particular parts of the story. The 2 volumes of Arthurian poems taken together form a considerable reinterpretation of the Arthurian material. To give us a basic approach, I'm just going to emphasize 3 fundamental points, 3 points which I think are really important for understanding what Williams was trying to do. First of all, and I'm deliberately repeating this because I think it's so important. Williams does not primarily tell the stories. He assumes that we already know them in outline. That's point number one. Point number two, and I think in a way it's even more important, though it's much harder to define. Williams treats the Arthurian legends as a complete body of myth. The Arthurian legends have always had this curious kind of intermediate status because they have attached themselves from a multitude of sources to a particular historical period, the period of the just following the Roman withdrawal from Britain in the 5th to 6th centuries. And we have the sense that there is perhaps a historical author behind them. They're always described as legends, but what Williams does is to treat them not merely as legends, but as myth. What I mean by this is that Williams assumes that like the Bible, or like the epics of Homer, the Arthurian legends contain within them every aspect of life, and indeed of cosmology as well. And for me, that is to make the step from a collection of legends to a myth. Williams treats the Arthurian material as myth, as a complete and coherent body of myth, including the archetypes of all fundamental situations and a complete cosmology as well. He does not see the Arthurian legends simply as a collection of stories about this and that, which deal with some things and leave others out. For Williams, and I really have to sort of hammer away at this, the Arthurian legends are for him a complete set of archetypes. All fundamental situations and dynamics of life are to be found within them. Though I should emphasize that he does see the legends, he does treat the legends as being Christian, and this is most obviously present in the part played by the Grail. Williams was most interested in the Grail as the archetype of communion itself, of the rite of communion or the Mass as the link between, the ritual and sacramental link between man and God, between the world and the divine. But he sees the legends essentially as myth and as forming a complete cycle. And of course, if some aspects of life and meaning appear not to be found within the Arthurian material, then Williams adds it and makes sure that it is. So here and there, he extends, he deepens, he adds new episodes to create that sense of a complete mythical world. In Williams, I think we have most clearly, for the first time, the Arthurian material treated as the mythology of Britain, perhaps even as the mythology of Christendom in a secular sense. The third essential point, which follows from this, is that Williams makes some fundamental historical adjustments to the legends. He does locate them loosely in a historical sense, and the most important of these is that he treats Britain, or Logres, as he calls the realm, following the old Welsh name for the island of Britain, Lloegres. He treats Britain, or Logres, as an outlying province of the Byzantine Empire. That is, although it is self-contained and somewhat barbarous, Logres, or Britain, is ultimately part of a larger empire ruled from distant Byzantium. This is the political counterpart to the fact that Logres is part of Christendom. On the spiritual level, the realm is part of Christendom. On the political level, it is part of Byzantium, of the Byzantine Empire, and the one reflects and indeed integrates the other. The two are conjoined. Secondly, to enable this to happen and to gain other layers of meaning, Williams moves Arthur's historical period forward so that it coincides with the early Islamic conquest of Spain in the 8th century. This means that he then has Islam available both for narrative purposes, for example, as a source of non-Christian knights within the Arthurian panoply. And also it gives him a worldview which is religious and spiritual and deist, but contrasts with Christianity. So the benefits for his fiction of having Islam available as a contrast are considerable. In Williams's eyes, the most important fact about Christianity, I think it's fair to say, is, of course, the incarnation, the birth of God in flesh, in human form. Whereas, again in Williams's view, by denying the incarnation, Islam separates the physical world from God, producing a dichotomy between flesh and spirit. Williams treats Islam with respect, but he also disagrees with it on this ground. Putting Arthur into a world which contains both Byzantium and Islam enables Williams to heighten the contrast between a worldview which sees the material world as potentially filled with the divine, and, by contrast, a view which separates the physical from the spiritual. Williams had a strongly systematizing mind, which was fascinated by correspondences and patterns. His love of pattern went along with something very unusual for poets, which is that he was keen on mathematics. He's the only poet I've ever come across who consistently uses the word diagram as a favourable term. He likes diagrams. You don't find many poets saying that. In his systematizing imagination, Williams is not unlike Blake. He likes to use overlapping patterns of symbolism where the parts correspond to one another. And so he makes the geography of the Byzantine Empire correspond to the human body. The frontispiece of the original edition of Taliesin through Logos, the 1938 volume, showed a map of Europe with a woman's body superimposed upon it, with the head lying over Britain, the breasts in France, the hands folded at Rome, the buttocks over the Caucasus Mountains, and the womb at Jerusalem. Now, as soon as you go through that list, you can immediately see all kinds of symbolic possibilities. And as with Blake's distribution of the districts of London and so on, you can see that the systematizing poet loves the many, many possible meanings that can be drawn out from a correspondence between an integrated empire and the harmoniously integrated human body. The meanings immediately are sort of multiplied and powered up by that overlapping of correspondences. We have a microcosm and a macrocosm, with the empire functioning ideally as a fully integrated human body, a body politic on a large scale. Also, like Blake, Williams often gives his characters multiple levels of meaning. They're people, but they're also far more than that. Just to give one example, Merlin and his sister Briseine are indeed the familiar wizard and his human sister. But also, Merlin is time and Briseine is space. I rather suspect that this notion ultimately came from Blake's prophetic books, where we have the male and female couple Los and Enopharmon, who again represent time and space. So Merlin is Merlin, but Merlin is also time. Briseine is also space. Again, Williams' version of Nimue, the Lady of the Lake. Nimue is also nature, and so on. So you can see that Williams, by this kind of method, sets up an enormously poetic universe with the potential for many levels of meaning. But obviously none of this is worth anything at all unless the poems actually work when we read them. And to my mind, there's no question that they do. But having said that, I must at once qualify it by saying that the poems work wonderfully so long as they are allowed to work at first reading by means of sound, rhythm, and imagery. If, as new readers of Williams, we approach his work expecting to find an immediately extractable prose meaning, then we're going to be hugely frustrated. The meanings are there, but they don't come at once. The poems are complex and obscure, and they yield their meanings, their conceptual meanings, only gradually as we get to know them. A couple of years ago, I met a group of enthusiastic French readers of Charles Williams, And I asked them whether French readers did not find the obscurity of Williams's poems discouraging. And their answer was very interesting. They said, not at all, because French readers are quite accustomed to la poésie hermétique, that is, to hermetic poetry, mysterious, magical, mystical poetry, poetry which is evocative, suggestive, delightful through its patterns of sound and imagery, hinting at meaning but not disclosing it all at once. English readers, on the other hand, tend to expect poetry to deliver information. We expect poetry to tell a story, to describe things, to provide material which, as some of us will remember from the O-level English examinations of our youth, can be turned into a plain prose paraphrase. You remember how you used to be given chunks of poetry and you had to give a plain prose paraphrase. Well, you try doing that with Williams, it's not that easy. As, of course, it never was with many other poets either, but Williams presents particular difficulties. To appreciate the poems of Charles Williams, you must first be enchanted by their sound, their rhythms, their imagery, by what C.S. Lewis characterized as the soaring and gorgeous novelty of their technique. Soaring and gorgeous, I think this is absolutely right. Williams has the most wonderful poetic texture, sounds, rhythms, images. Once these cast their spell over you, and you begin to become familiar with passages, you will find things starting to fall into place. The poems gradually, to use a crude word, decode themselves, as with the more difficult parts of Eliot, as with Blake. But you can't hurry the process. So almost as an experiment in this kind of approach, without further ado, I'm going to go straight into reading you a passage which is on those sheets I've given you. It's passage number 1 from The Son of Lancelot. This is one of the poems from the 1938 volume, Taliesin through Logos. What I would ask you to do is simply to listen and to picture in your mind's eye what the images which arise from the poem. Just let the poem happen. A white wolf drove down the wood's path, flying on the tender knowledge of the third heaven, out into moonlight and Brisenne's grey eyes. She called, "Be blessed, brother." The child sang, "Blessed, brother," and nestled to its first sleep. Merlin broke from the wood and crouched to the leap. The father of Galahad smelt his coming. He turned, swerving from his hunger to the new danger, and sprang. The driving force of Merlin struck him in mid-air, and full the force of the worlds flung. Helpless, he was twisted and tossed in vacancy. 9 yards off, the falling head of Lancelot struck the ground. Senseless he lay, lined in the lupine shape. Dimly, half man, half beast, was Lancelot's form. Brisenne ran. With wrappings of crimson wool, she bound the child to her crouching brother's back, kissed them both, and dismissed. Small and asleep, and warm on a wolf's back, the high prince rode into Logos. Well, I hope you'll agree with me that these lines have the ring of major poetry about them. They certainly do to me. Much of this, I think, comes from the mastery of vowel and consonant sounds, the emphatic use of alliteration combined with the richly varied range of vowel sounds in so many of the lines. Look at that first line, "A white wolf drove down the wood's path." To read that line emphatically is a physical pleasure in itself. Try reading that aloud when you get home. You'll find you'll enjoy it. There's also the use of internal rhyme. You'll find both these, the alliteration and the internal rhyme, in those last 3 lines. She bound the child to her crouching brother's back, kissed them both, and dismissed. Small and asleep, and warm on a wolf's back, the high prince rode into Logos. The sound patterns are masterly. Combined with the very vivid imagery, there's a delight in the texture of words which makes such passages a physical pleasure to read aloud. Some of this undoubtedly comes from the fact that by the time he wrote Taliesin through Logos, Williams had extensive experience of writing for theatre. And he'd come to know by experience how to make lines which could be effectively spoken. Now, I said that Williams's Arthurian poems are not principally narrative, but this one obviously does, among other things, tell a story. The context, this is just a short passage from a much longer poem. The context is the madness of Lancelot. After Lancelot has been tricked into sleeping, he's been drugged, in fact, and he has slept with the Princess Helene in the castle of Carbonek, believing her to be his beloved Guinevere. His night with Helene is fateful, for he begets upon her a son, Galahad, who will one day achieve the Grail. When Lancelot finds that he has slept with Helene and thus been unfaithful to Guinevere, and into the bargain has begotten a child, he runs mad. And in Williams's version, not merely runs mad, but actually changes into a wolf who prowls around Helene's castle, hungering to devour his own son. As Williams puts it earlier in the poem, this is your following passage, but it actually comes from an earlier passage in the poem, man he hated, beast he hungered, both stretched his sabres and strained his throat. Rumble of memories of love in the gaunt belly told his instinct only that something edible might come. Slavering he crouched by the dark arch of Carbonek, head high howling, lusting for food, living for flesh, a child's flesh, his son's flesh. In the scene we looked at first, Merlin has seen from a distance, by clairvoyance, what is happening. Merlin changes himself into a white wolf to intercept the wolfish Lancelot. And when Brizen brings out the baby from Helene's chamber, she's able to bind the child onto Merlin's back, the back of Merlin in his wolf shape, so that Merlin can run with the child from the wild forest of Broceliande, where the castle stands, into the realm of Logres and deliver the child safely to Camelot. As you can see, the explanation is lengthy and complicated, whereas the verse is immediate and powerful and mysterious. To appreciate and understand Williams's poetry, we need to read as much as we enjoy reading, then put it aside for a while, and later, days or weeks or months later, return, read some more, and so on. And in this way, as with all difficult poetry, as with Eliot, as with Dylan Thomas, as with Blake, understanding and enjoyment gradually grow. The poem clarifies itself in our mind as we gradually assimilate it. To give some sense of the shape of Williams's major poems, I'm going to go on to read and discuss extracts from some of the more important ones in a way that I hope will offer some sense of how he treats the Arthurian myth and of how the parts fit together. Always with the sense that it's a mistake to take the footnotes, to take the explanations as the meanings. The meaning is the experience of the poem. The footnotes come later insofar as we decide we want them. Near the beginning of the sequence, the poet Taliesin, who is often used as the viewpoint within the poems and with whom Williams frequently identifies himself, Taliesin, the bard, first comes to the kingdom of Logres. Taliesin was, in reality it seems, a 6th century Welsh bard, and in the poems Williams makes him a poet who has both pagan magical knowledge and the blessings of Christianity. He is christened, but he's also trained by the Druids in the pagan mysteries. In Taliesin's return to Logres, Williams pictures the bard landing on the British coast, the coast of Logres, from a ship which at once leaves him there and returns to Byzantium whence it came. I'm going to read again. The seas were left behind. In a harbour of Logres, lightly I came to land under a roaring wind. Strained were the golden sails, the masts of the galley creaked as it rode for the Golden Horn, and I for the hills of Wales. In a train of golden cars the emperor went above, for over me in my riding shot 7 golden stars. as if while the great oaks stood, straining, creaking around, 7 times the golden sickle flashed in the druid wood. Covered on my back, untouched my harp had hung, its notes sprang to sound as I took the blindfold track, the road that runs from Tales, through the darkness where Circe's sun sings to the truants of towns in a forest of nightingales. I omit some lines here. I saw a druid light burn through the druid hills as the hooves of King Arthur's horse rounded me in the night. I heard the running of flame faster than fast through Logres. Into the camp by the hazels, I, Taliesin, came. Just to annotate this a little bit, the Golden Horn is, of course, the heart of Byzantium. I think still known as the Golden Horn to this day. The emperor here represents God working in the world. So the 7 shooting stars overhead are perhaps a token of divine providence, but they're compared to strokes of a golden sickle to remind us also of Taliesin's heritage as a British bard inheriting the mysteries of the pagan Druids as well as Christianity. His track through the forest is the road that runs from Tales, and in a way I think we have here a glimpse of Williams himself writing his narrative as a passage, a journey that comes from the heritage of tales in the past into the unknown future, the road that runs from Tales. And the western coastal forest of Brocéliande, where he lands, is also the realm of the imagination. Circe's son is, of course, Comus, the smooth-tongued enchanter of Milton's Masque, who dwelt in the depths of the forest, dangerous because he could lure and trap travellers. Williams feels free to introduce references to Milton here, and indeed also at other points to Wordsworth and Yeats into his Arthurian cosmos, because, as I keep repeating to the point of wearisomeness, Williams is treating the Arthurian material as myth, and thus essentially as timeless. It's as if all poets are available to converge upon this myth which he's exploring. I was delighted to see that in his Arthurian Commonplace book, Williams has jotted down knowledge that time and space are only modes of thought. Is not this the beginning of all magic? And he attributes the quotation to the story of the amulet by E. Nesbit. But it shows his interest, in a sense, in getting rid of the conventional notions of time and space and having all of time and, in a way, all of eternity and all of the cosmos available to converge upon the moments which his poems illuminate. Later on in the sequence, there comes a point where we realise that Taliesin has actually heard Wordsworth reciting the Prelude. There's a reference to the Snowdon passage in the Prelude, which seems to be also part of the consciousness of this Dark Age bard. But for Williams, all poets are simultaneous. Why not? In that final stanza of the passage I've quoted, King Arthur's horse, of course, here means the king's troop of horse, the horsemen. Flame is running through Logres because the kingdom is in disorder and Arthur has not yet imposed peace and become king. He has to conquer raiders, pirates, and internal disorder before he can take his throne. And Taliesin is going to help him to do this. The placing of Arthur's Britain, or Logres, within the Byzantine Empire allows Williams to give his poet Taliesin a knowledge of the Roman poet Virgil. And it's the presence of thoughts of Virgil as an inspiration which enable Taliesin to play his part in a military as well as a poetic sense in bringing order to the kingdom. And in view of the systematizing quality of Williams's imagination, the military and the poetic are connected. Indeed, they're seen as models, one of another. This is displayed best, I think, in the poem called Mount Badon, about the legendary battle where Arthur defeated the Saxon invaders and established his kingdom. Williams tells us the king's poet was his captain of horse in the wars. In other words, Taliesin, the poet, is also the leader of the king's troop of horse. And as Taliesin, at the battle, awaits the right moment to give the order to charge, he has a vision of Virgil which enables him to choose his moment. I'm going to read the passage, which is the next one on your sheets, and we begin with Taliesin sitting on horseback with his troop waiting behind him. It's a wonderfully cinematic passage, not unlike, of course, the famous cavalry charge in the Olivia Henry V. Here's Taliesin preparing to lead his troop into battle. Staring, motionless, he sat. Dimly behind him he heard how his staff stirred. One said, "He dreams or makes verse." One, "Fool, all lies in a passion of patience, my lord's rule." In passion of patience he awaited the expected second. Suddenly the noise abated, the fight vanished, the last few belated shouts died in a new quiet. In the silence of a distance, clear to the king's poet's sight, Virgil was standing on a trellised path by the sea. Taliesin saw him negligently leaning. He felt the deep breath dragging the depth of all dimension as the Roman sought for the word, sought for his thought, sought for the invention of the city by the phrase. He saw Virgil's unseeing eyes. His own, in that passion of all activity but one suspended, leaned on those screened ports of blind courage. Barbaric centuries away, the ghostly battle contended. Civilized centuries away, the Roman moved. Taliesin saw the flash of his style dash at the wax. He saw the hexameter spring and the king's sword swing. He saw in the long field the point where the pirate chaos might suddenly yield, the place for the law of grace to strike. He stood in his stirrups. He stretched his hand. He fetched the pen of his spear from its bearer. His staff behind signed to their men. The Aeneid's beaked lines swooped on Actium. The stooped horse charged. Backward blown, the flame of song streaked the spread spears and the strung faces of words on a strong tongue. The household of Taliesin swung on the battle. And so on. The way in which Virgil serves as Taliesin's inspiration brings out, first of all, Williams's sense that all times are simultaneous. The distance of centuries does not separate the two poets. Secondly, there's the bringing together of the ideas of civil order and poetic order. The passage depends on a sense that Roman civilization is founded as much on the poetry of Virgil as on the military power of Augustus. That in a sense the pen and the sword, rightly used, can be equated. Taliesin saw the hexameter spring and the king's sword swing. And again, he stretched his hand, he fetched the pen of his spear from its bearer. Metaphorically, the pen and the spear are one. Both are used to create order and harmony. The battle which ended the Roman civil war and gave power to Virgil's patron Augustus, is equated with the Battle of Mount Badon, which gives power to Taliesin's king, Arthur. The Battle of Actium and the Battle of Mount Badon are simultaneous in vision, though not historically. Mount Badon is perhaps basically a narrative poem. Other poems, even when they seem to tell a story, have a different function. They use elements from the Arthurian legends to explore philosophical and religious insights. One such is the departure of Merlin. Its narrative element is very simple and merely seems to present the idea that once his work is done, with Arthur on the throne and Galahad, as we have seen, safely at Camelot, Merlin takes ship for Byzantium and leaves the kingdom of Logres forever. But as I understand it, Williams is treating Merlin's departure also as a way of dealing with a phase in the history of the world, or perhaps in the history of our consciousness of the world, a phase where the material world ceases to radiate divine meaning and hardens into physical matter and into the material world as perceived by science. The poem's mysterious in many ways, and I certainly don't claim to understand it all. But as I mentioned at the beginning, it has to work, first of all, by its own music and images. And I think this one does magnificently. So I will read some of the departure of Merlin. I omit the first stanza. The blessing of Byzantium befriends the world's ends. The great heretical doctors, Muslim and Manichaean, fly. In time-spanned Camelot, the table changes. The method of phenomena is indrawn to Brocéliande. Merlin bore Lancelot's child to a moon of white nuns, a knot of nurture in a convent of spirits and sons. Thence, in the perilous throne, is the child's moon risen. Pillars of palace and prison changed to the web of a wood. And I omit a little bit more here. Joseph of Nazareth, Joseph of Arimathea, came dancing through the coeval-rooted wood's idea. They saw Merlin descending. They met him in the wood, foster fathers of beatitude to the foster father of Galahad. Twin sons of womb and tomb, there no strife is except growth from the roots, nor reaction but repose. Vigours of joy drive up, rich-ringed moments thick in their trunks thrive, young-leaved their voice. Moons and suns that rose in rites and runes are come away from sequence, from rules of magic. Here all is cause and all effect. The laws of Merlin's boyhood are unknown in Nimue's wood. The purple sail moved in the wind of Brocéliande. The sailors sprang to the oars. The sea-call sang, bidding tack, near and far, infinite and equal, on the visionary ocean track to the port of Byzantium. More than the fable of dryads is troth to the table in the growth of hazel and elm, oak and bamboo. Voice of all moments covers who hears as he goes, rich-tinged, young-leaved, monstrous trunks rejoice. Time's president and precedent, grace ungrieved, floating through gold-leaved lime or banked behind beach to opaque green, through each membraned and tissued experience, smites in simultaneity to times variously veined. She who is Nimue, lady of lakes and seas, articulation of limbs, accumulation of distance, brings all natural being to her shape of immortal being, as to a flash of seeing the women in the world's base. Well has Merlin spoken the last spell, worked the last image, gone to his own. The moon waxes and wanes in the perilous chair, where time's foster child sits, Lancelot's son. Well, again, to provide footnotes and comments, Brocéliande is the great mysterious magical forest on the seacoast. Here it's also seen as the realm of Nimue, who is nature. The forest of Brocéliande is the forest here, I think, of the material world. We are in it now, all these things that surround us. When Williams tells us that the method of phenomena is indrawn to Brocéliande, I think he's saying that communication of spiritual truths directly to man through the material world, through phenomena or appearances, has ceased. Material things now appear to us, not as images of divine truth, but simply as things, objects. Merlin brings Galahad, his foster child, to Camelot, where he sits in the perilous seat at the round table. This is in Malory. We know that Galahad is the one who is going to achieve the Grail. I think the moon is emphasized because we are now, in a sense, in the realm of illusion. Direct spiritual knowledge has been withdrawn from the world. Palace and prison, the highest and lowest points of human experience, or if you like, heaven and hell, are now no longer clear. They are changed to the web of a wood, and hidden and confused in our experience of the world as material. The web of the material world is both the spider's web in which we're stuck and the extremely complex tissuing of factors like a weave through which we have to find our way. There is clearly, I think, also a whole sense in which this passage can be read in terms of the Kabbalistic tree of life, and that's a whole material for another lecture, but I think the palace and prison, those pillars, are probably the pillars of justice and mercy, whose forces come to a focus on the lunar sphere of Yesod, which I think is where the child is now placed. But those who are aware of Kabbalah can follow that through as they like. Williams, what I've called his schematizing imagination is very evident. Williams brings together Merlin, who was the foster father of Galahad. And to add layers of meaning, Williams implies here that Galahad himself, in a way, is a Christ figure. He brings the foster father Merlin together with Joseph of Nazareth, who in a sense was the foster father of Jesus, and the other Joseph, Joseph of Arimathea, who entombed Jesus in the tomb from which he then arose again, and hence was in a certain way the foster father of Christ's death and descent. But of course also the tomb then becomes a womb, so he's a foster father in that sense as well. So the two Josephs are connected and overlapped. Womb and tomb overlap and connect. And Merlin as foster father is also interconnected with the other two. William sees the two Josephs, one presiding, as it were, over Jesus' birth, the other over his entombment, and he puts them together and then adds Merlin, protector and foster father of Galahad, and makes them a trio of protective guardian foster parents of the divine. They come through the coeval rooted woods idea in that passage. Coeval, because everything ultimately is simultaneous in Williams's imaginative world. Time is only a mode of thought, as we know from E. Nesbit and the Amulet. The two Josephs come to meet Merlin through the idea of the wood, through its spiritual Platonic archetype, through perhaps even its imaginative concept in the poet's mind, not through its physical reality, even though the wood itself symbolizes the material world. But however timeless they may be, in another way, they do come at the end of something, because we are told moons and suns that rose in rites and runes are come away from sequence, from rules of magic. Here, all is cause and all effect. That is, with the departure of Merlin, magic no longer works. In the material world as we now know it, everything is a seemingly mechanical process of cause and effect. But divine grace is still present, permeating the material world like a light that shines through the leaves of trees. When Williams says, more than the fable of dryads is troth to the table in the growth of hazel and elm, oak and bamboo, I think he means that though we can no longer see spiritual beings and magic everywhere, the dryads, we can still keep our faith, our integrity, our troth to the round table, our loyalty to the king, to the emperor, to God. These are more important to us now. These are what will guide us through the seemingly perplexing world of material nature. The bamboo is here, of course, to bring in a sense of Asia as well as Europe, and it connects with the dark side of Williams's myth, the hellish realm of Polu, which is sort of round towards the Pacific. I don't have time to go into that now, but bamboo also has a very particular meaning here, I think. And divine grace is always present, Williams is saying, as he expresses it in a wonderful stanza, which I think has a great deal of Gerard Manley Hopkins about it. Time's president and precedent, grace ungrieved, floating through gold-leaved lime or banked behind beech to opaque green through each membraned and tissued experience, smites in simultaneity to times variously veined. Grace precedes and presides over time. It's always there, like the light through the leaves. And the leaves then become a metaphor for our experiences in life. As Williams puts it, each membraned and tissued experience. And grace is able to move through time in many directions. Like the leaves again, time is variously veined. We know that Williams was interested in unorthodox ideas about time. Some of them perhaps more orthodox now than they were in his day. Ideas not only such as those of Einstein, but also such as those of J.W. Dunn, ideas which challenged the conventional linear notion of time and suggested that time might be a dimension which in some ultimate way is all simultaneously present, even though we don't perceive this as we move through particular bits of it. This is an important idea in Williams's work. Thus, in another Arthurian poem, Taliesin on the death of Virgil, Virgil, after death, is saved. Although a pagan, he is saved by the love of his readers for him, even though the readers don't come to love him until long after he has died. Their love exerts a force backwards through time, or rather beyond time altogether. In the same way, Williams believed, at least sometimes, that the sacrifice of Christ saved those who had come before him as well as after, whether they were, as it were, within the Hebrew tradition or not. The sacrifice of Christ happened in time, but its waves, as you might say, rippled both backwards and forwards through time and reached those before as well as those after. Here in the poem, Nimue, who is nature, in time brings everything to fulfillment, but the magic is gone. We must work by grace and faith. In other words, by troth to the table, by loyalty to our oath, to our faith. In Williams's sequence, the Grail is achieved, but Arthur's kingdom falls, principally because, like Adam, Arthur makes in his heart the wrong choice. Like all of us in one way or another, he is confronted by the ultimate question: the king made for the kingdom, or the kingdom made for the king? In other words, are we here to serve, or is the world here to serve us? Arthur makes the wrong choice, and through vanity and selfishness sleeps with Morgause, thereby begetting Modred, who will kill him. The kingdom, after its brief flowering, falls. Its spiritual essence withdraws to the mystical realm, and mundane history follows, or, as Williams writes, Logres was withdrawn to Carbonek. It became Britain. The few poems I've been able to discuss probably give an idea of Williams's originality, of the way that he comes at the body of Arthurian legend from many different angles, sometimes telling stories and sometimes using aspects of the myth as he himself develops it to explore other ideas and concerns. The poems probably seem very obscure, but I hope that some of their music and magic and beauty have been communicated. If you fall under the spell of Williams's poems, the meanings emerge as you get to know the poems, as the poems sink into your mind on successive readings. Williams himself died suddenly in May 1945, a few days after VE Day. He was only 58 years old. His death passed almost unnoticed because of the massive world affairs which were then taking place, the last weeks and months of the war. His books went out of print because of the paper shortage caused by the war. The efforts of Eliot, Auden, and Lewis to bring him back to popular attention were only partly successful. His poems, I think, now seem so difficult to us, partly because they've not had the critical attention granted to Eliot and Yeats and Blake. They're not on academic reading lists, and their phrases have not entered the common currency, as have, for example, Eliot's still point of the turning world, or Yeats's slouching towards Bethlehem. Both of these phrases which journalists can quite happily draw on in newspaper articles and expect people to pick them up comfortably, even though both phrases come from poems every bit as obscure as Williams's. The problem is not really one of obscurity, but of unfamiliarity. But to me, this body of poems represents a major work of 20th century poetry, not unworthy to stand beside the better work of Eliot, Yeats, and David Jones, a reinterpretation of the Arthurian material that gives it its full weight as the mythology of Britain, and a body of material capable of sustaining profound and universal meanings, expressed with the full resonances of 20th century poetic technique. I hope that if you haven't come across Williams before, you'll take these handouts with you, reread them, and maybe go on to explore Williams further. And if it should be that I've merely been demonstrating this evening an eccentric personal enthusiasm, I hope I've at least fired one or two of you with a desire to pursue Charles Williams's Arthurian poems a little further. Thank you.